So let's head over to the country of Rwanda. They just had their elections this past week, and the past president, Kagame, was reelected for the third time. But before we get into that, let's take a look back at how he came to be the president. Long ago, really long ago, Rwanda was settled by two groups of people, the Hutu and the Tutsi. They wandered into Rwanda and settled down raising cattle. Most of the cattle were owned by the Tutsi, while the Hutu became the farmers. You could easily switch from Hutu to Tutsi based on marriage or how many cattle you could acquire. But really the country was ruled by the king, who was Tutsi. And of course, the upper class, who was also Tutsi. Then in 1984, the Germans colonized Rwanda and decided to divide up the Rwandan people based on how they looked. They saw the Tutsi as being more like them, with much lighter skin and in general much taller than the Hutu. So they put the Tutsi in all the higher roles of responsibility. But then after World War I, the Germans lost their colonies and the Belgians took over Rwanda. The Belgians liked the Tutsis too because they looked and acted so much like them. In 1933, the Belgians solidified the categories of Tutsi and Hutu by mandating that every person was to have an identity card that labeled them either Tutsi, Hutu, or something called Tuwa, which is a very small group of hunters and gatherers. Most of the good jobs in education went to the Tutsi because they were upper class. The thing that was kind of hard for the Hutus to swallow was that they made up nearly 90% of the population, and the Tutsi only 10%, and yet the Tutsi got all the really good leadership and political positions. Later in the 1950s, Rwanda tried getting its independence from Belgium, which worried the Belgians, so they decided to switch sides. They made friends with the Hutu, who was the majority of the population, and made them in charge of all the leadership positions. This, of course, made the Tutsi very mad. But the Hutu took their new power and tried to squash the Tutsi. Then in 1962, Rwanda got its independence from Belgium, and for the next several years, the Hutu seeked revenge on the Tutsis. And from 1962 to 1990, hundreds of thousands of people were killed. So the Tutsis fled Rwanda, fleeing to neighboring countries like Uganda, who at the time was ruled by Idi Amin, who was also good at killing. So the Tutsis were basically a race without a home. But there was also an issue at the time in the country of Burundi, where the Tutsi relatives had power, so they decided to start killing Hutus there. So the Hutus from Burundi fled back into Rwanda to escape the Tutsi leaders of Burundi. The big problem was that in Rwanda, even though the Hutu were in power, there were many Tutsis left and many more in neighboring countries, and this really worried the Hutus, who were very scared of the Tutsi taking power back. Meanwhile, many corrupt Hutu politicians were getting rich off of foreign aid, but the regular farmer population was really staying poor. Then in 1989, the coffee markets collapsed, the prices plummeted, and many of the Hutu had no more income. It was around that time that the children of the Tutsi that had originally fled to Uganda decided to make themselves a rebel army and go back to Rwanda and get their lands back from the Hutu. People like Paul Kagame, whose family took him to Uganda when he was only 2 years old, however later was in the Tutsi army and eventually became its leader. This was the time in which the Hutu went on the radio and warned people that the Tutsi were coming back to make them all slaves again, just like in the past, and they were planning to murder all the Hutu children. Several countries tried to get the two sides to talking to each other and to come to some kind of peace deal, which they sort of did. The president of Rwanda made a deal with the Tutsi army that they could come back to Rwanda. This came after the Tutsi rebels were able to take control of part of Rwanda. The president of Rwanda, a Hutu, decided to negotiate a ceasefire. But the Hutu began referring to the Tutsis as outsiders who had come into the country before and stolen power, which of course was completely untrue. The Hutu and the Tutsi came at the same time. They had the same language. They even used to intermarry each other until the Belgians came in and separated them all into classes. Anyway, the Hutu were not going to give up any power to the Tutsi, and they continued spreading fear to all the Hutus that the Tutsi were planning to kill them. Then in April 1994, the president of Rwanda's plane was shot down. Immediately, the Hutu blamed the Tutsis to the point that the whole country went insane with fear and revenge, even though it was actually believed that it was the Hutus who actually staged the attack, as the military would not let any foreign government examine the wreckage or had any meaningful investigation into the president's assassination. The radios told people to kill all the Tutsis, that an attack was just beginning and the Tutsis must be wiped away from the earth. It was then that what is commonly known as the 100 Days of Genocide started. The government made it legal for anyone to kill Tutsis. In that 100-day time, 800,000 Tutsis were killed. There were these death lists that came out with the names of known Tutsis and also moderate Hutus who were sympathetic to the Tutsis and wanted peace. The Hutu militia began aiming the Hutu population with machetes that could be used for killing the Tutsis and their sympathizers. Now, at the time, there were UN peacekeepers in Rwanda. However, they were ordered not to do anything, that they were not to engage in fighting in any way. But the genocide was finally shut down by a military victory of the Tutsi army led by Paul Kagame. He became vice president of the country and controlled the military to maintain law and order. However, many of his soldiers carried out retribution killings of the Hutus. The Hutu fled to refugee camps formed in Zaire and other countries in which they planned to return to Rwanda. But the army of Rwanda would indiscriminately attack these camps, killing an estimated 200,000 people. Between 1994 and 2003, Rwanda was governed by a set of documents combining the assassinated president's constitution and the peace deal with the Tutsis. As required by the deal, Kagame set up a constitutional commission to draft a new permanent constitution. The constitution had a set of fundamental principles, including equitable power sharing and democracy. In 2003, the Constitution was approved by Parliament. It states that political organizations are prohibited from biasing themselves on race, ethnic group, tribe, clan, region, sex, religion, or any other divisions that may give rise to discrimination. In essence, making Rwanda a one-party state that was no longer Hutus or Tutsis. Also, 2003, Kagame won the election for president by an overwhelming margin, something like 95% of the vote. Many criticized the election, saying that a win of 95% was not possible under any circumstances. However, Kagame was sworn in for his first 7-year term. In his second term, under the two-term system, he was to run against a Hutu who had fled to abroad and returned to announce their candidacy as president. However, she was arrested and accused of threatening the security of Rwanda. She was eventually released on bail, however, was not allowed to run for president. Later, she was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment for breaking strict laws on denying the 100 Days genocide. This was highly criticized by Amnesty International. Kagame ran against people that basically supported him, and anyone who criticized his government was not allowed to run. Kagame won the election by getting 93% of the vote. Opposition and human rights groups said the election was tainted by a lack of any credible competition, as well as repression and murder. Anyway, we are now up to last week. Kagame rewrote the Constitution, allowing him to run for another term as president, which of course he won by getting 99% of the vote. That means that people running against him couldn't even get their own families to vote for them. So is Rwanda better off than it was in the past? Is the election fair if no one is allowed to run against you? Is the bitter battle of the Hutus and Tutsis really at an end? This is The Jam here on DZRJ Radio, Voice of the Philippines. My name is